The most famous number in artificial intelligence just vanished. For a year and a half, everyone argued about one figure, $6 million, the rounding error China supposedly used to humiliate Silicon Valley. But that 6 million trained an old model back in 2024. When DeepSeek built their real monster, bigger, and trained on more than double the data, they refused to say what it cost at all. The lab that got famous for its price tag took the price tag off. And why they did that drops you straight into the thing underneath all of it. A chip war the West is quietly losing. So let's find the number they didn't print. This is the DeepSeek V4 technical report. More than 300 authors, 32 trillion tokens of training data. Scroll to the part where they tell you what it cost. The GPU hours, the dollar figure, the one number that made them famous. It isn't there. The lab that stapled a price tag to the whole AI industry, whose entire legend is we did it for 6 million, for their biggest model ever, went silent on the cost. And that silence is the story. Because to see why they stopped talking, you have to understand what that number never actually meant. Here's what 6 million actually bought. One training run, the final one, the single clean pass that turns a finished recipe into a finished model. That's the electricity for the last lap, quoted as the price of the whole car. And DeepSeek told you this themselves. Buried in that 2024 paper is a line most people skipped. This figure excludes all prior research. The failed runs, the dead ends, the architecture that took months to get right. 6 million was never a lie. It was just an answer to a question almost nobody was asking. So if the invoice doesn't tell you what a frontier model costs, what does? The real money hides in the parts you can't see on a bill. And it's not a list, it's a chain, where each move forces the next. But first, you've probably heard someone correct that 6 million figure with a much bigger, much scarier one. They're wrong too. And why they're wrong is the key to the whole thing. The correction goes like this. A research firm called Semi-Analysis dug into DeepSeek's actual hardware and said the real spend wasn't 6 million, it was closer to $1.6 billion. Over 200 times higher. Case closed. The underdog story was a lie. Except, look at what that billion actually covers. It's their entire fleet of chips, every GPU, running every experiment, serving every user for the life of the company. 6 million was one lap. 1.6 billion is the whole factory, forever. Neither one is the price of the car. The real number sits somewhere in between, and DeepSeek left the space blank. So let's fill it in ourselves, and follow what it actually takes to train a model this big, this cheap. It starts with the optimizer, the algorithm that decides, at every step, how the model should change. For years, everyone used the same one, called Atom. V4 uses something newer, Muon. And Muon has a track record. In independent tests, it reaches the same skill in roughly half as many steps. Half the steps is close to half the compute. DeepSeek won't tell us what that saved on a run this size, but on a model this big, half is millions of dollars, quietly never spent. And here's what the hype leaves out. Muon isn't theirs. It was published in the open, in 2024, by a researcher named Keller Jordan. Anyone could have used it. DeepSeek just used it first, at a scale nobody else had dared. And that scale is exactly the problem, because when you push a model this big to move this fast, it starts to break. This is the part nobody warns you about. Push a model this size hard enough, and the training can just destabilize, spike, turn weeks of compute into garbage overnight. So DeepSeek built their own fix, wired into the model itself. They call it MHC, and unlike the optimizer, this one is genuinely theirs. But MHC doesn't make training cheaper. It makes every step about 6.7% more expensive. A lab obsessed with cost chose to pay more, on purpose. Because that overhead is nothing next to 100% loss when a run dies at week 3. MHC is insurance. That's not a lab cutting corners. It's a lab counting the costs nobody else thinks to count. So now the run is fast, and it's stable. And it still isn't enough, because the chips can barely talk to each other. We covered this last time. The export ban didn't take DeepSeek's chips away. It throttled how fast they could talk to each other. The whispering kitchen, cooks who can barely hear across the room. And a fast, stable training run is worthless if the chips spend all their time waiting to pass messages. So DeepSeek went hunting for bandwidth where nobody is supposed to look. Every NVIDIA chip ships with a documented set of instructions, the official menu of what the hardware promises to do. DeepSeek found one that isn't on the menu. An undocumented read NVIDIA never guaranteed would work, that moves data faster than the sanctioned way. Sit with that. They reach beneath the manufacturer's own manual, into behavior it explicitly does not support. And then they open sourced it. Published the trick with a warning label. This shouldn't technically work. Here's the switch to kill it if it breaks. Other engineers said it was unsafe. DeepSeek shipped it anyway. Because when your hardware is rationed, You don't get to be precious about the hardware's rules. Now, maybe you're thinking what a lot of people thought. None of this clever engineering matters, because they cheated. They copied the Americans. In February 2026, Anthropic, the lab behind Claude, said exactly that. They accused DeepSeek of distillation, quietly harvesting Claude's answers to train a rival on the cheap. Real accusation, real evidence. DeepSeek's name at the front of every headline. So read the evidence. Anthropic published their own numbers. 3 Chinese labs, 16 million harvested conversations. Of those 16 million, one company accounted for 13, another for 3. DeepSeek's share was 150,000, under 1%. And 150,000 conversations can seed a test set. It cannot build a frontier model. The company that did the least got the headline, because DeepSeek is the name that sells the story. This channel is named after a horse. Clever Hans looked like he could do arithmetic. What he was really doing was reading the room. The distillation panic did the same thing. It looked like proof. It was a headline, wearing proof's clothes. And there's a mirror image to all of this. Everything so far was about training cheap. But last time, we saw DeepSeek also serves V4 for around 87 cents a million tokens, a fraction of what the American labs charge. Same obsession, other end of the pipe. And it isn't new to them. Their last model already guessed ahead, with a technique called multi-token prediction. V4 pushes it further, an open-source tool called DSpark. A small, fast model sits in front of V4 and guesses the next few words, and the big model just checks the guesses instead of writing every one from scratch. Same output, roughly double the speed, so roughly half the serving cost, on hardware they already own. Cheap to train, cheap to run, neither one is luck. Which raises a question that's been sitting under this whole story. If DeepSeek is this resourceful, why? The legend says they had no chips. The legend is wrong. DeepSeek was born inside a Chinese hedge fund called Highflyer. And back in 2021, before the export bans existed, that fund quietly bought around 10,000 of NVIDIA's best AI chips. 10,000! Before anyone was watching. By some estimates, the full fleet today runs to 50,000. So this isn't a lab that's starving. It's a lab that optimizes like it's starving, while the pantry is full. And that is the real tell. The question was never, how do the poor kids cope? It's why the well-stocked ones act like every chip is their last. Here's why. Those chips are melting. Every NVIDIA GPU in that stockpile is one DeepSeek can no longer legally replace. The controls didn't just take future chips off the table, they turned the existing ones into a countdown. And the H800S they do have are the throttled ones, deliberately hobbled for the Chinese market, as we covered last time. A horde of handicapped chips, depreciating, impossible to restock. So every trick, the optimizer, the insurance, the instruction below the manual, buys the same thing. Not money, time. Independence from a supply that can be cut off at any moment. They optimize like it's finite, because for them, it is. Which is why the real war isn't about software at all. It's about whether China can build the chips itself. Start with what already works. V4 doesn't run its everyday answers on NVIDIA hardware. It runs on Huawei's own domestic Ascend chips. And that split is deliberate. The precious stockpiled NVIDIA chips are saved for the delicate work of training, while domestic Huawei chips carry the massive job of serving millions. A handoff, engineered right around the sanctions. But running a finished model is the easy half. Training one is the hard half. And in June 2026, that line moved. A Huawei-led team, not DeepSeek, a group of Chinese researchers and engineers, took the finished V4 and ran its final stage of training entirely on Huawei chips. About 1,000 of them. No NVIDIA in the loop. So picture a ladder with 3 rungs, running the model on Chinese silicon, done. Fine-tuning it on Chinese silicon as of last month, done. The top rung, building a model from scratch, the giant, unstable, expensive part. On all Chinese chips? Not yet. That one still needs NVIDIA. On domestic silicon, training from scratch still breaks down. Unstable runs, chips that talk too slowly, rougher software. 2 rungs down, 1 to go. So, why did the lab famous for its price tag suddenly go quiet about the price? Because the number stopped being about money. Muon, MHC, the instruction below the manual, the melting stockpile, the Ascend chips, every one of them is really about the same currency. Not dollars. Silicon. Independence from a supply the other side controls. The cost of DeepSeek V4 is real. It's just not a number they can put on the front page anymore. It's written in how many of these tricks they need before they don't need NVIDIA at all. There's 1 rung left on that ladder. Training a frontier model. From nothing, entirely on Chinese silicon. And you can't reach it with a clever optimizer or an undocumented instruction. Software has taken them as far as software can go. The last rung isn't a trick. It's It's a factory. Whether China can manufacture a chip good enough to birth these models without asking anyone's permission, that's next time. Huawei's quiet, enormous bet to build that chip and stop depending on the West for silicon entirely. The board is still being set. We'll see the next move together. If you want to see how this fight actually plays out, subscribe. We read the papers, so the hype can't. Clever Hans. See you next move.